Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed that interview with Warren Klug. If anything, again, no matter what side of the issue you're on, you can feel the passion that Warren is bringing to the issue. And I would suggest to you that when you get involved in government, whether it's at your school board level or talking to your congressman, the passion will always come across. And it's the passion that sells. The passion is, it's like a product. And you're selling what you believe in, you're selling your passion. And I think Warren speaks so eloquently for his issue, but it's his passion, I think, that drives it. One of the things that I wanted to drill down a bit inside, not this particular issue, but any issue, and it does impact on the immigration issue, is kind of some inside baseball, some inside lobbying, some inside baseball. And as I said at the beginning of the show, we're going to talk about process. There's a few topics that we're going to dwell on throughout the course of none of the above, but I want to give you some highlights tonight, and then I want to overlay how they impact the stuff that Warren's talking about and his coalitions in trying to pass immigration reform. So what I think what we'll do here is I'm going to invoke my inner Lou Dobbs, and we're going to go to the blackboard, or the whiteboard rather. We've got 5 topics up here that we're going to talk about. First one is bait and switch. This is a common topic that you talk about when you go to buy a car, bait and switch, or some product at a store. But to me, bait and switch is a common political gambit that gets played by our legislature, by our elected officials, which could be happening right now with immigration reform. As you'll notice during our interview, we talked about the fact that the U.S. Senate has in fact passed a piece of legislation to deal with immigration reform. Again, I don't have an opinion on the merits of the bill, but it has passed. We're now in the House of Representatives. We talked about the fact that maybe Speaker Boehner will or won't let this particular issue come to a vote. What happens a lot of time with legislation is one chamber, in this case the Senate, will pass a piece of legislation, and then the other chamber will pass a piece of legislation, but they won't match up. And at the end of the day, you find that nothing happens. Yet when the election cycle occurs, your senator comes home and says, well, I voted for immigration reform, and I'm a champion of this issue. Your congressman or your state rep, whatever the issue is, may come home and say, I voted for that, I was a champion for that. Well, the answer is nothing got done. Nothing got done because the 2 houses didn't agree, they couldn't come together. This is something that, we'll talk about more in the show, but I think you may see, or again, if you want to have immigration reform passed, you hope it doesn't occur, you may be seeing play out in the context of immigration reform. Stalling for time, obviously, our Congress is great at stalling for time. Most people think this is the classic do-nothing Congress, but there's reasons that they stall for time, and I think it's important to understand that some of those reasons. One of the reasons is just because there are election cycles, and they want to make sure that their votes are timed to intersect with a particular election cycle. Maybe they want to align a vote to a primary, or they want to align a vote to the general election. Another part of stalling for time is stalling for money. This is the second element here. Now, the Senate will pick on immigration reform already. They've already passed immigration reform, and there's U.S. senators that have already voted on this. They, of course, want to raise money for their elections. They've made their vote. They're going to have a hard time going back to constituents and saying, I need to raise some money, help me out. Sure, I voted for your issue, what can you do? The real pressure on raising money and the real stall that comes involved in raising money is the longer you drag this out, the more you can go back to constituents and say, hey, this is a tough issue, I can be with you, but I've got a tough election come up, and if you want me to be with you, so to speak, we've got to tie the vote and the money, not in an illegal or legal sense, but it's out there and we can't avoid it. So stalling for time, stalling for money. Another thing we talked about with Warren is where's the pressure. And you could have issue pressure and you can have election pressure. Now, issue pressure is kind of rare. When you think in terms of immigration reform, this has been talked about for almost 20 years now. There has never been enough issue pressure. The immigration reform has never bubbled to the top of the list. It's never been the it issue. It's never been what has to happen in a particular Congress for almost the last 20 years. An example of issue pressure, of course, was when our economy was falling apart and Congress passed TARP. They didn't pass TARP, maybe we would have ended up in a depression, who knows. But there was an issue pressure, there was a catastrophe upon us, that had to be solved. Immigration reform doesn't rise to that level, and in fact, many issues these days are not rising to that level. So you've got this, this notion of how do you create pressure as an issue, you might not succeed. So the next part of creating pressure is how do you create election pressure? How do you make your congressmen feel that they can't come home without voting for your issue? And we talked to Warren about this some, and I don't know if Warren feels that he is creating that pressure that's necessary. He's making a great case. His group is making a great case. They've got some good issues that they're talking about, but they're not sensing that they're creating that pressure where their Congressman Scott Tipton, in this case, feels he can't come home without that vote. Now, in Congressman Tipton's case, and we're going to talk about this on some other programs, he has some election pressure that is this relatively new phenomenon because within Republican caucus, there is more primary election pressure these days, or just as much primary election pressure as there is general election pressure. So timing ties out in terms of where's the pressure, and if you're going to put election pressure on, in other words, you won't get reelected if you don't make the right vote here. There's the primary season, and then there's the general season. The last issue I want to talk about, and again, just briefly today, and hopefully you'll join us, so we're going to drill down in a great deal on all these issues, is the composition of the legislature, and I really should have put legislature and executive here. There's a few different combinations that are possible, not that many actually. One is the executive branch and the legislative branch can be all one party. Now, when President Obama was first elected, the entire legislature of the Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, it was entirely Democratic. And when you hear a conversation about the Affordable Care Act, you hear part of those conversations noting the fact that it was only voted on by Democrats. Nothing, I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, but that's one formulary. At the same time, you'll note that when the Democrats did control the executive and the legislature, they didn't pass immigration reform. Similarly, I believe when President George Bush was in office, there was a short period of time when there was complete Republican control. I don't exactly know what they did or didn't accomplish during that period, but it was a relatively short period of time. Another mix that is obviously available is the executive branch could be one party and the legislature could be another party. So when you have that set up, the legislature might get together and pass what they think is important legislation, meaningful legislation, but then they're facing the veto that comes with the executive branch. The third combination, which is of course what we're facing now, is when the executive branch is the same as one house of Congress, in this case the President and the Senate, and then the other house is the second party. So here the Democrats control the presidency and the Senate, and the Republicans control the House. In that case, you have the Republicans being the stopgap for their party on every issue. And since they're the stopgap, there's a lot more pressure and a lot more stalling, a lot more bait and switch, a lot more possibility for failing to build pressure, all these other issues we talked about. And I think some of that's what's going on right now with immigration reform, that the Senate being controlled by the Democrats has already passed it. They've announced that the president will sign it, and now the ball moves over to the remaining House, and it moves over to the Republicans. So these are some of the dynamics of the system. And again, I said we're going to talk about process. These are some of the dynamics of process that you have to understand if you're going to drill down and understand politics in America. And that's, again, one of the things that we will cover on None of the Above.